Oh,
Okay, hi, welcome back to Safer Countries conversation with Andy Goddard, the Legislative Director for the Virginia Center for Public Safety. My name is Paul Friedman, and I'm the founder and executive director of Safer Country, a gun violence prevention nonprofit devoted to keeping guns out of unsafe hands. We've convened this conversation. It started last week, and we'll be going on throughout the session in order to follow what's happening in the session with regard to new gun laws being proposed. And while we're doing it, we'll be talking about past gun laws and those that were passed just in the last year in particular that relate to the new laws. And we may have some conversations about those laws that are interesting. Interesting stories to tell about how they passed and why they're important. So thank you for joining us. I know that people are very busy at this time, and so we expect that this will be watched on tape as opposed to seen live, but we appreciate that, and we hope that when you do see it, you'll consider contacting us, letting us know what you think. My email is paulfriedman@safercountry.org, and you can find Andy at vacps.org. That's the website for the Virginia Center for Public Safety. Today is a particularly important day. It's the anniversary of the birthday of Martin Luther King Jr. It's the 92nd birthday. So we have 8 years until we can celebrate the centennial. But we have gone through a very difficult time this week in our nation, and we've watched an attempted coup of our constitutional government. We've watched people killed by guns in the process, or threatened to be killed by guns and other weapons. This is not the world MLK would have wanted to see, and it's not the world that any of us really want to see. Before we get into further discussion of this, I just want to point out that yes, for the second time in one presidency, the current president has been impeached for high crimes in connection with instigating the attack on the Capitol. It's stunning and frightening. It's still something we're all absorbing, but we can't ignore it. It's obviously related to what we're doing because so many of the people who are taking part in this are armed and they are dangerous. And that goes directly to the laws that we pass in our society to protect us from abuse of guns. So let me take a moment then to turn to Andy and thank Andy for joining us once again. And first, let me just say hi and thanks for coming. And maybe you can start by, before we get into the new laws, to talk a bit about what's going to happen on Monday, which is the actual day of celebration of Martin Luther King's birthday. And we have a lot of activities going on in our state then. So Andy, take it away.
okay. Thank you very much for giving me this chance. Monday, Martin Luther King Day, would have been the 29th vigil that the Virginia Center for Public Safety held to commemorate the currently more than 1,000 Virginians who were killed by guns each year, and the well over 2,000 that are injured, and the untold number that are psychologically damaged by the effects of gun violence, and of course the family members of those who are killed or injured. Unfortunately, because of the actions of the gun lobby and the extremists and separatists, or whatever they want to call it, insurrectionists, the governor has declared a second state of emergency on top of the COVID state. So we had planned, because of COVID, to have a token event at in person at the Capitol at 11 o'clock. We had a permit for that, or we were applying for a permit for that. We were going to have less than 10 people, and we were going to stay 6 feet apart with masks, and we were going to just do the basics of remembering the dead and honoring the injured. However, because of the second state of emergency, because of threats of violence by gun extremists, and to be honest, threats of intimidation by the Virginia Citizens Defense League, the Department of General Services has failed to issue any permits, even after we've been through all of the procedure. So we're not allowed to do the in-person, even a token event. No one will be allowed on the Capitol grounds. Grounds are now ringed with fencing. Roads are going to be closed for days. And this is the second year in a row that the gun lobby has basically stymied what would have been our free speech rights to commemorate and to hold a vigil for those who have been killed by gun violence. And that's just not good enough. You know, we have free speech rights just as anyone else does. And I don't think the actions of another person should be able to take that away. However, we're going to have the vigil and a discussion about the upcoming legislation via Zoom starting at 1 o'clock on the same day. And the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence is organizing that. You can find it at csgv.org. You can find the information how to get onto that Zoom call.
You can also find it at your website, Andy.
That's true. Yeah.
And let me just take a moment to want to promote your group. And let me just take a moment to remind people that they can find last week's, our first chapter of our conversation on the safercountry.org website, if you want to catch up with where we were last week. But please go on.
That's about it. I think, you know, it's very telling that a group that wishes to hold a peaceful assembly is being again stopped from holding that assembly by people who don't honor the idea of free speech. They honor the idea of gun intimidation, and that's nothing. You won't find that anywhere in the Constitution.
Absolutely. Let me just take a moment to step back to last week's conversation. We closed and we were beginning to speak a bit about what is often called a red flag law. It was passed under the title essentially of a substantial risk protection order in our state. It's also known as an extreme risk protection order to many organizations around the country. It's called extreme risk law by the Brady campaign and by the Everytown for Gun Safety group. Different states have different titles for this law. And it's somewhat confusing in that respect to be able to talk about it and market the idea of how important this law is. But I do want to point out that Safer Country, when we did our first conversation about this law back in June on a Zoom event, a Zoom forum, we focused in a bit about one story that might be able to help bring some attention to this law, and it's really in need of attention. It has 19 states have it, including Virginia, Maryland as well, nearby. But Connecticut was first, California, Florida, a red state, so-called. But the law still needs attention. It needs a full implementation in those states and needs to be passed in others. The story we told was about John Lennon. Great many people still remember the Beatles, love the Beatles, and love John Lennon, and miss John Lennon. Last December was the 40th anniversary of when he was gunned down outside of his home in New York City. And what was remarkable about that story and connected to this law is that we learned a few years ago that the shooter had actually talked to his wife in advance about his intention to kill John Lennon and actually showed her the gun and the bullets that he acquired to do that. And had that law, which now is in Hawaii, where the shooter and his wife lived, he flew from Hawaii to New York twice before he killed John Lennon. Had that law been in place in Hawaii then in 1980, and had it been well known, his wife might have had an avenue to seek help from law enforcement and intervene in a way that would have been decisive in helping to prevent John Lennon's death. Now, this law is already doing a lot to prevent suicides. It's a major impact, and in some homicides throughout the country. It can do more. But I wanted to raise that and let our viewers today and on recording know that this law can make a difference. We often hear people who are opposed to laws that restrict some use of guns, that those laws would not make any difference. Laws can make a difference. Do you have any thoughts on this, Andy?
Yeah, I do actually, and it's in relation to something we said last week, in the sense that we're trying to do many of these things on a scientific basis, and we need to analyze their efficacy while they're being implemented. And one thing that has been put forward in this 21 session is a bill, House Bill 2258, which is a small bill, very technical. And basically, it allows the Virginia State Police to keep records of when the substantial risk protective order is used, and to, at the end of the year, I believe, submit a report which outlines the number of times it was used and the type of cases. Obviously, there would be no identifiable information involved, but it would be an aggregate of the number of times that one was issued, and the number of times there were applications, the number of reasons why things failed, maybe. And it would definitely begin to give us information so that we don't have to rely on past things and anecdotes that we've heard, but we'll actually be able to know how many times it's been used and to what effect.
That's really important. And in the Zoom call, in the Zoom conversation that was held by Safer Country back on June 25th last year, of course, our Virginia law went into effect on July 1st. So we've only had 6 months or so with that law in place. But we wanted to talk about it then in anticipation of that. And on that call were the Commonwealth's attorney here in Alexandria, who's on the advisory committee, as you are, Andy, to Safer Country. We appreciate that. And also our police chief. And they both committed verbally then to provide information to us at the end of the first year to give us insight into how this law was working. Obviously, they didn't want to reveal personal information, but no, in the aggregate,
necessary. Yeah.
Right, in the aggregate, we want to know, for instance, how many people attempt to use it, and of those attempts, what happens? What percentage of them goes on to actually being completed? And for those that, where orders are issued, what happens then? Also, I think it's really interesting to note that in the law that was passed in Virginia, if someone rejects the initial protection order and says they don't have any weapons in their home to a law enforcement agent, the law enforcement agent needs to get a search warrant if they feel appropriate to go in and search for a weapon. It'll be interesting to know how many people, when confronted with the initial protection order, puts up that argument and a search warrant is necessary, and how often that is issued. So there are a number of stages to provide the kind of due process that people want in a law, which is why this law was tested in the courts recently and found constitutional. And that's why it continues to be operative.
I would just add that the search warrant would only be initiated if there was substantial reason to believe that the person was not telling the truth, such as a spouse or family member saying, "He told you he has no guns. He's got 5 guns." Something like that. Then the police would then go off and seek authority to get a search warrant to look for those guns and nothing else.
Right. And we're also going to need to find out in each jurisdiction where this occurs, where an effort has been made by either an officer in law enforcement who wants to apply this law, or someone in the non-law enforcement community who's approached law enforcement seeking help, how the judges are reacting and how they're basing what they're basing their decisions on. Is their analysis consistent from jurisdiction to jurisdiction? Are they getting trained on how to respond, what to look for, how to make a judgment? This is an area that is getting more attention around the country in terms of training for judges and whether or not they should have some sort of basic information like a card that provides them some basic things to consider when confronted with this, often in an emergency situation, which is, after all, the nature of this law. It's intended to intervene in an emergency. Isn't that right, Andy?
Yeah, I believe that's the responsibility of DCJS, the Department of, I just had it,
Judicial.
Department of Criminal Justice Services, sorry,
Okay.
DCJS. I believe they're the ones that take the laws and then promulgate regulations and information and suggestions to how the law will be implemented.
We should probably get a copy of what they're producing and take a look at that for our edification.
That's a big rabbit hole I have never ventured down yet.
Well, we've got a lot on our plates, but it's something we can look at together.
Yeah.
So let's, okay, I think we've touched on that sufficiently for the moment. And I know we've got a lot on our plate with just 40 minutes remaining in our 1 hour program. And once again, I want to thank everyone who's tuning in and watching this because it really is important that we talk about these gun laws. So let me just talk about the fact that, Andy, your group has identified 21 laws that have now been introduced into the current session that relate to firearms. And of them, some you consider good, like the one we just discussed. Some you oppose, your group opposes, and others are still being assessed. Do you want to give us an overview of the ones that you think are most important that have been introduced and you think have some chance of success? And we'll start with that.
The important bills that we support. It's hard to rank your children, but I would say that the two bills in relation to keeping firearms out of certain localities are important. One of them is the bill to, where are we? Levine's bill to keep guns from polling places. Currently, this is a bit of a mess because some polling places are in schools, in which case school regulations apply. Although when schools closed, there's been some argument as to whether they're still schools if they're not open to students, which I think is nonsense because I think a school is a school, whether it's the students are there or not. But anyway, so that would make it very, very clear that you would not to bring guns within 40 feet of the building where the election was being held, the voting was being held. The second one is Adam Ebbin, Senator Ebbin, I should say, has introduced a bill which will do several things. One of them is to codify then McAuliffe's, Governor McAuliffe's executive order, which keeps guns out of state buildings. That would then cover the Pocahontas building and the Capitol, which are both, by the way, under the purview of Capitol Police, and they are under the purview of the House Speaker. But the Capitol grounds are a different issue. And the bill here increases or codifies what was just a rule made last year by the House and Senate to keep guns out of Capitol grounds. But that was just for permitted events. This bill from Senator Ebbin, which is SB 1381, would actually make it illegal to carry guns onto the Capitol grounds, period. So that's a very good bill. We support
Let's take a moment and talk about that because I think people need to understand that these bills don't come out of the blue. They're not willy-nilly, right? No. We just saw something in Michigan in the last few months, which was truly frightening. And we're also being told, where our governor's life was at risk, and there were people with weapons who were literally taking over the state capitol at one point, if I recall. And we now have a situation in the country where we have our top security telling us that we have serious threats, not only to our capital in DC, our nation's capital, but to a multitude of capitals in the states around the country. So this is a critical piece of legislation, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely, absolutely. And let's put it this way: many of these laws, in an ideal society, we wouldn't need a law like this because it would be common sense. But those laws have been brought about by the gun lobby in response to their behavior. If they had not misbehaved and threatened and intimidated people with their weapons and acted in a manner which was inconsistent with the Constitution, then we wouldn't need these laws. But unfortunately, they did do those things, and we just needed to make people safe in those areas.
You know, it's ironic.
Public space, you know, the Capitol grounds are a public space. People go in there. It's a beautiful garden in the middle of the city, benches. It's a beautiful, peaceful place to sit and eat your lunch when the weather's right. So why should they have to be bothered with people with guns parading around?
And they shouldn't, and we shouldn't have a situation in which people are intimidated by people carrying guns in their presence, especially those who are showing them off really for political purposes with no actual need, unlike a law enforcement member of law enforcement. And it's ironic and frightening in a way that so many people who have been in law enforcement or the military participate in the efforts that you've described and we've seen around the country, these riots, these attempts to intimidate people by marching into state houses with weapons, and have now ended up in a riot on our an insurrection on our Capitol in which an actual police officer, someone who was actually a Trump supporter, was killed. Others were assaulted. Some were nearly killed, and we actually almost saw legislators killed, and it could have been en masse. It's a frightening situation. It's a complete disregard for the law enforcement, which so many of these people came from and claim to support with these statements about Blue Lives Matter. All lives matter? Yes. Black lives matter? Yes. Blue lives matter? Yes. All of the above is true. And
human lives matter.
I'm sorry?
Human lives matter.
Human lives matter. But most importantly, perhaps, the rule of law matters. And that's why we go through issuing laws, and that's why we go through a democratic process to get there. And we put that up against the Constitution. And if they survive a test against the Constitution, they must be enforced, and people must respect them. Everyone, whether we disagree or agree. So let's go to another law, if we may. What's next on the list of things that you consider?
Next on the list, I would suggest is again somewhat technical bill, and it relates to misdemeanor family violence or assault and battery of a family member. There are two bills been introduced, a House bill and a Senate bill, which appear at first glance to be identical. Basically, what we're trying to say is the federal government's law is that you're not allowed to purchase or transport a firearm if you've been convicted of a family related assault and battery. However, we want to put in there possession, because being too dangerous to buy a gun and being too dangerous to transport a gun, why would you not be too dangerous to possess a gun? So we're trying to get possession added to that particular thing. Now, the two different approaches are somewhat important. The first one, the House bill, is very encompassing in the sense of it uses the existing language for a family member.
Which number bill is that, if I may?
This is Kathleen Murphy's House Bill 1992. And the definition of a family member there used is the same definition that's used elsewhere in the code. And it's a very long list of people, including, husbands, wives, and includes also children and grandparents, basically siblings and everyone else in the family, that very extended length of family. And that bill is looking to raise the penalty to a class 1 misdemeanor. Now, class 1, of course, carries jail time potential, so it has a fiscal impact. Now, the second bill by Barbara Favola, which is Senate Bill 1382, has a different definition of family members. She deviates from the existing code one, and she removes all of the references to siblings, children, and grandparents, etc., and leaves parents. It's basically to go after adults. The situation that makes it different is, for instance, if two brothers have a domestic dispute, or not necessarily domestic because they're not living together, but if two brothers have an assault and battery event, one on the other, then one of these bills would cover it and one of them wouldn't. And I tend to think that it would be better if they're two adult people living separately in different locations, or even living together, then I think they should be dealt with under the normal assault and battery. It isn't necessarily an assault and battery based upon their relationship. It's just an adult against another adult. And that would be better from the aspect of the Senate bill. And the Senate bill leaves it at a class 3 misdemeanor, which of course does not have jail time potential, therefore does not have a fiscal impact. I think we can probably get the Senate bill passed. The House bill, though it would be a little more strict, is probably going to be conformed to the Senate bill eventually. But it was very important to go after this type of possession because, as we always say, the biggest predictor of future violence is past violence. If you're prepared to be violent towards a family member, then obviously you have so little feeling and empathy for your own family members. What do you feel about the general public and someone you might meet in the street? Obviously less. So, these are not the kind of people who need to be carrying weapons.
Right. Well, of course, Kathleen Murphy has had her own personal experience with gun violence, losing her brother.
Exactly.
Do you know much about that story?
I've heard her tell it a couple of times. Yes, it was very, very moving.
It is, and so she has a personal stake in this. Look, I lost a family member, a distant cousin, to gun violence, to a bullet, and she was 83. I had just had lunch with her that week, and later in the week, the crime occurred. So many of us have a stake in this. By the way, I take a personal note of pride that Delegate Mark Levine is my personal delegate. Senator Adam Eben is my personal senator for where I live. So their work on these areas have been outstanding.
Yes. Great guys on this issue, both of them.
Yeah,
have been for a long time. Looking at a couple more things I'd like to mention, honorable mentions we're going into now.
Well, we've got a lot we got a lot to talk about. We have time. Go dig right in. And let me take a note right here. Let me just stop at a halfway point just to mention once again that you are Andy Goddard, and you are the legislative director for the Virginia Center for Public Safety. And we thank you again for being here for this conversation. Please continue.
Yeah, the next one I would say that has potential is, this is getting out probably a little bit more ahead of a problem than we're used to. Usually we wait until the problem gets absolutely horrendous and then try and do something about it. This one is in relation to an issue called ghost guns, which are guns which are unserialized. And at one time, nobody really thought about this issue. Because there was not as much a building of guns. But now, of course, the background check being expanded in many, many states, people who can't get a gun legally are resorting to buying the components for a gun and assembling them. I have no problem at all with people assembling their own guns, provided the main component, which is this receiver or whatever you want to call it, the main part of the gun, contains a federal traceable serial number. If it doesn't, it's a burner gun. It can be dropped at a crime scene. If there are no fingerprints on it, no one would ever know where that gun came from. So first of all, it makes it illegal to have that kind of equipment. And it highlights the fact that the people who are selling the components have to sell the major component with the serial number on it. So you can't sell a blank. And even the getting around it, which is what they do with AR-15 receivers, is they sell the receiver not complete. In other words, it needs a small machining performance before it can be used. And it usually can be a very simple thing, such as drill a hole or file something, but it's not completely manufactured. And they believe that they can get around the serialization by selling you something which is you have to do something to it. And I believe that's covered also in this bill.
So please tell me the number of this bill and who's introducing
this bill is, I should do that every time I've mentioned a bill. House Bill 2276 by Marcus Simon.
Okay.
Another couple of bills in relation to background check. There's Alfonso Lopez, Senate Delegate Lopez has put in a bill. Currently, there's something which we call the Charleston loophole. If you apply for a background check to purchase a gun, and in our case, the Virginia State Police is confused about whether you are eligible or not because of something in your past which they need more details about, then they can take time to go to the court where something was issued and find out if the court made that prohibitory or not. And what kind of, for instance, if you have some sort of a drug conviction, you need to go to the court records to find out whether that was a prohibitory gun prohibitory adjudication or not. And in the case of the Charleston shooting at the Mother Emanuel Church, the shooter there was under examination by the instant background check system because he had convictions. But when the instant background people checked, the FBI looked, they went to the wrong court and they made a mistake. They picked the wrong court. And by the time they got information back, the 3-day period, which is allowed for them to do this examination, had expired. And the crazy thing about this is, if you pass 3 days and your background check has not been approved, the default is to proceed with the sale, which I think is very dangerous. Well,
highly dangerous.
I'd love to get rid of the default proceed and have it so that you couldn't buy the gun unless you got a positive, absolutely positive, this person is legally allowed to buy the gun. Not we're still checking. So Delegate Lopez's bill takes that 3-day period and puts it out to 5, because as we know, Dylan Roof took the gun on the 3rd day, and on the 4th day, I think it was the day after, he killed people in the church. And at that point, the FBI was just getting to the point of realizing he should not have been sold that gun. So we call it the Charleston loophole. Delegate Lopez's bill would fix that.
That bill is number what?
Sorry.
2128.
2128. Yeah.
Now,
another interesting bill.
Before we go on, Andy, let me just touch on that real quick. There is a national bill that's going to be addressing that's passed in the Congress on the House side. HR 8, I believe, is the number. And it will probably have to be reintroduced in the new Congress and passed by the Democratic House before it goes to the Senate. That bill would extend the time, I believe it's 10 days. And
I mean, it's very rare that they need any extra time, because it's only in a case where there's some sort of confusion, or that they need to find information from a court and the court doesn't respond immediately. So it's not like it's going to hold everybody up, which is what people are saying. Mm-hmm. This is a very rare instance, but it's an important instance. And if we can't get rid of the default proceed, then we need this.
Right. And so after 5 days under Lopez's bill, would it still have a default?
Yeah, the default proceeds still there, but it gives them a little bit extra time.
And why wouldn't that be something we could change in Virginia and amend that default procedure so that there's more time if needed, if necessary?
That would be a great thing, a great bill to put in. I don't know whether it would get through our Senate at the moment. That's the problem. And I'm sure that's what's holding people back from trying that.
Well, we ought to test it, in my view, just to see what happens and what the vote is, and see who it is that might be interested in.
You get somebody in an election year to stick their neck out that far, yeah?
Well, there you go. That is a problem in some parts of the state, right? So some of us are more seeking greater success than we perhaps can expect.
Well, you know, it's always good to have a stretch goal.
Yes. All right, so we're going to get in a moment, before we close, we have about 22 minutes left or so. We are going to close with some talk about how people can be involved in the process of advocating for these good laws, and how they can work with you to do that. But let's go on to the next law that you're concerned with, that you want to raise. I'd
like to quickly just mention a couple more of the good ones. Senator Deeds has put forward a bill which, in response to a couple of serious incidents that have happened recently, where someone has gone to a gun range and they are people who are unable to purchase their own weapons. They've gone to a gun range, they have rented a gun, they've gone to the back of the gun range to shoot and shot themselves in the head. The problem is going to be getting this bill passed, but basically what it does is it would require the gun store to look for a criminal background check, or a background check in general, you know, it's not just criminal stuff, before they could rent a gun to someone.
So this would be at a shooting range, you're saying, before they rent at a shooting range?
Well, yeah, sometimes, actually quite a number of gun stores have their own range in the back to allow purchasers to go and try guns and stuff like that, or at a large range where guns are available for hire.
So there are no background checks for rental of guns currently?
No, I believe not. And now the difficulty is the instant background check system is only for purchase. So the Virginia State Police could do a background check, but they might not be able to ask for the information from the NICS, National Instant Check System, because that was not set up for anything other than purchasing.
This creates a question. You know, are guns only allowed legally to be rented for the use at a shooting range, or is there any limitation on how a gun can be rented
and taken away somewhere else for a period?
Yes.
I believe that's probably one of those things that's fallen in the cracks. I don't personally know of any regulation like that.
Something we might want to.
In these particular cases, it was for use on the premises, so it was a sort of a temporary, not like a rental car where you drive it away. You know, you had to use it on the premises.
Well, something we may want to look at in the future, especially. But in this particular case, how do you feel?
As I was saying it, I was thinking
that. How do you feel about the likelihood of success of this law? And do you think the people who are at these ranges are equally concerned about people who are unstable or stable but decisively seeking to commit suicide?
I would like to think so, because this is not these two cases are here in lately in Virginia. This is part of a problem. It is known that some people will commit suicide at gun ranges. Some gun ranges have had quite a number of them, and obviously it's not the sort of thing that's good for business. If not, it's obviously not good for the person who ends up dead. But
yeah. What about the businesses that have had these experiences? Have they expressed a political view?
That I don't know. That I don't know. Businesses, gun businesses, are usually very circumspect about going out in public about legislation, because they don't want to raise the ire of the gun lobby. Last one I'll mention actually is a small one, again by Kathleen Murphy, House Bill 1998, which works with lockdown drills. And this is probably not considered much of a firearms bill, but we are very concerned about what's happening in our schools. And it would reduce the number of lockdowns. My personal opinion is that lockdown drills in schools should be age specific. I don't think there's any benefit whatsoever in frightening elementary school children or even secondary school children by having them, believe that somebody's out there with a gun and this is how you hide. I think that the adults who are responsible should be the ones who do the drill, not the frightening the kids. When you get to middle school, high school, maybe it's different, especially high school. But we shouldn't be having very young children have to run and hide in closets and stuff. It's bad enough if it ever happens. And let's face it, as I've said many times, for every 100 children in school-age children in Virginia that's killed by a gun, one of them is in school and 99 of them are not. And until we start to do something about the 99 that are not, then we should worry after that about the one that's in school. And at the moment, that one that dies in school is getting all of the publicity, all of the press, all of the reaction, and the 99 are dying with no attempt to stop what happens.
Well, this calls to mind the idea that if someone loses something in a dark room and there's a light in the far corner, they turn on the light and look where the light is. They have no hope of finding it in the rest of the room, but they don't go looking in the rest of the room because the light is in the corner. And if we only look at situations where, there's also a performative nature to this. Obviously, it makes people feel good if they enact something and do something that is noticeable, which is holding these kind of drills. It tends to reassure parents that people are doing something to try to prevent their kids from being harmed. But how effective really is it, and how harmful is it? Do you think we'll be seeing any psychological studies in the state about the impact
I
on
believe
kids?
they're already underway. I believe they're already underway. I remember, as a child, I ducked under my desk on occasions because we were worried about Russian nuclear weapons. And my desk was only a little piece of wood, so I'm not entirely sure whether a Russian nuclear weapon would have taken much notice of that little piece of wood.
They made films that we all laughed about, a few decades later about, duck and cover, with all these kids being told to get under their desks and as if that would help in any possible way. And I remember when I was in
they could reduce the mess.
Yeah, no, in middle school, I remember once in a while someone would say, "Oh, there's a rumor at 2:00 there's going to be a nuclear war," and people scoff because at that point, after many years of being told there's some crisis and it doesn't happen, you don't believe it anymore. In this case, of course, we have had some very noticeable and frightening shootings at schools around the country, and obviously that has an impact on our psychology. But your point about how many children are actually harmed in schools versus out of schools is critical. What laws do you think?
One's too many.
Certainly.
But, it so's the 99.
Yeah, right. And do we have any kind of laws that you think in the state of Virginia that address the kids who are being killed outside the schools with a particular focus on the kids?
Well, yes, the safe storage laws for the kids that are killed by other kids who find guns in the home, that kind of thing. Even school shootings. A lot of the guns that are taken to school by a school shooter, if they're school age, came from their parents or their grandparents not locking them up at home. A 13-year-old who takes a gun to school, he didn't buy it. The gun came from dad's closet or the bedside table or somewhere else. So safe storage laws would have a big effect on accidental death and on some of the homicides that take place for school-age kids.
Accountability for how people store their guns is critical. Ethan's law was passed in Connecticut, and the family behind that law lost their son, Ethan. He went to a neighbor's home. Within 15 minutes, he was dead. There was a gun. There were bullets in the house. They were not necessarily loaded at the time. And it was the lack of them being any proof that they were loaded, which led to the lack of accountability for the homeowner who had the weapon and the bullets. And so they sought and succeeded in Connecticut in passing a law that would put the same onus on someone who had a gun and bullets not loaded in the house and available to be used in such a manner as someone could be harmed as if they were loaded. Where do we stand on that kind of a situation here in Virginia?
Well, we got something passed in 2020, which strengthened child access prevention, especially in homes where children are being looked after by someone else during the day. But it's still an issue, you know. It seems to be with a lot of gun owners that if the gun isn't readily at hand, it's of no use. And to be honest, there are a lot of biometric gun safes where you just got to put your finger on a pad and the door opens up. It's not like you have to go looking for a bunch of keys and search around and then open the door and then pull it out, you know. So the argument that it has to be available all the time is a very dangerous one, I think. If you know, it's on your person in your own control, then fine. Right. But if you're not, if it isn't in control, if it's laid on a couch or it's laid on a table or even in a drawer of a bedside table, and you're not with it, then if a child can get hold of it, then it's shame on the person, and there should be consequences for that.
You know, we don't live in a world in which that kind of a crisis that is often imagined is actually, you know, true. It's more of a fantasy than a fact.
It's one of the myths that goes, you know, way beyond what reality is.
And I have to say, a friend of mine who lives in Israel, who I grew up with, his children had to join the military when he moved there, when he developed a family there.
National service.
Yes, it's required. And his daughter is an expert at training people in the military. She continues on in the military, and she returns home to her home. And whenever she does leave her post to come home, she travels with a gun. You know, the people in Israel, there's a great deal of fear. They live on a very small country, and they have much to be afraid of, much more perhaps than we do. We don't live in that kind of a state. And yet when she comes home, she doesn't just put the gun in a safe to protect those around her. She actually takes the gun apart. And she's taught how to take the gun apart. So bullets aren't just removed, the whole gun is taken apart and then put in a safe place. Because, you know,
same thing in Switzerland. You know, the Swiss have no standing army, and every male between certain ages has to go and do national service, and they are required to take their weapons home. But now, because of so many people committing suicide with their service weapon at home, they can take the weapon home. They can't take any bullets home.
Well, that's a fascinating point. And, you know, considering the high number of deaths in our country, suicide deaths by gun, by people who are either actively in the military or recently out of the military, we need to be considering new approaches. That may be one we should consider.
Well, I mean, the thing about that is, as I understand it, senior officers have tried on a number of occasions to just intervene in an educational fashion and telling the troops that, you know, the danger of having your service weapon or even your own personal weapon at home when you're going through PTSD and that kind of stuff. And they were stopped from doing that. They couldn't even advise the troops about the dangers. So actually physically doing something about it is going to be incredibly difficult when under those kind of circumstances. You can't even advise somebody about it.
Let's take a moment here to talk a bit about how people can take an active role in this coming legislative session to articulate their feelings in support of these laws. I think in our next conversation next week, we can take a little deeper look at what's happened with some of these laws in the first week. I know often they're addressed early on in session in the past, and we'll see how that goes this time. But we can also talk about the laws that were brought up that we want to oppose. There are a number of those laws, and we can delve into some of the less clear laws. But why don't we talk a bit about how your organization works, how you work, and how you involve the public in expressing their views on these laws.
Well, one of the most important things I tell people is you don't have to be a lawyer. You don't have to understand every single aspect of a bill. You know, it's hard enough to be able to do that if you've been looking at them for years. But you do have your visceral gut feeling about something when you hear the title of something about ghost guns, for instance. You don't need to know all of the technical details about that, but you know that you don't like the idea that people are building untraceable guns. So call your local representative and tell them. I understand that there's something going to be done about people building untraceable guns. I am entirely in favor of that, and please vote appropriately to support that idea. The same with any of the other things. You know, I don't think people who are beating up family members and causing serious bodily harm should be considered as a misdemeanor for a start. So, but if it is considered a misdemeanor, then they shouldn't be able to possess firearms. You don't need to be able to say with this bill number or that bill number. They'll know. But the thing is to make contact with those representatives. If they're representing something entirely based upon their own opinion, then they're not really acting as representatives, both senators and delegates. They should be listening to their constituents. And I can assure you that people with guns are calling them in large numbers. So we need to call in large numbers. And then if they get 10 calls on a bill from one direction and 10 calls on a bill from another direction, they're not necessarily going to just go out there and vote the way the gun lobby wants them to vote.
You know, in Northern Virginia, where I live, most of the legislators are reliable in terms of where they stand overall on this issue.
Yeah,
but not everyone.
Most.
In your experience, if there are some particular legislators currently who are problematic, who not really in sync with the thinking of your efforts as a lobbyist on these issues, and as we talked about, there are some laws that are just very difficult, more difficult to pass than others, even though Democrats, who overall have articulated a very strong position in terms of gun safety laws, do now control the Virginia government, which may be a little confusing to some people who don't, pay attention quite as much as others. So which legislators do you think that you'd want to articulate?
I thought you were going to say that.
Do you think that people might want to focus in on and maybe take a little extra effort to communicate their views to?
Well, up in Northern Virginia, you do have a tremendous slate of representatives and senators. Chad Peterson is a little squiffy on guns, let's put it that way. He has his own style, and I believe he's very sympathetic to gun owners, which is fine as long as it's tempered by, a reality. I don't have any problem with guns being used for certain issues, target practice, what have you. But there are certain times when I think that we really need to remember that only 1/3 of the nation is regularly associated with guns. 2/3 of us aren't, and that 2/3 should have a strong voice. And so, I can't imagine any area in Northern Virginia, especially, where you can safely sit there and say, I'm voting with the gun lobby because that's what my constituents want. Because I don't think Northern Virginia is heavily pro-gun. Now, if you're in Southwest Virginia, that might be a different story, in some parts of Central Virginia. But up in Northern Virginia, it's not going to win you a lot of friends.
So, people often hear about the NRA, that it's based in Virginia, and they wonder whether it's still as powerful as it once has been. There's talk because of internal issues that have come to the news that it may be less effective. And you mentioned another organization that's even more active.
Yeah.
Talk about that group a little bit and the NRA and how do you view their power and their influence at the moment, both these groups?
Well, I think the NRA is getting a little bit of a pass because just at the point where a lot of information was coming out about the nefarious things that were going on there and their financial issues and a lot of people being fired or let go, or a lot of things were associations with Russia which were very suspect. That's when COVID comes around, and that's when other things like the issues with the current president, and I think they've managed to skulk off into the shadows a little bit, and I think they've not been as harmed as they should have been by the revelations that were made. So hopefully they don't get away with this scot-free and just continue on, because it won't take them long to get back to being, people have short memories. It won't take them long to being just as influential as they were in the past.
And the other organization you mentioned?
GOA, I don't know.
Spell that out. What is that for people who don't know?
Gun Owners of America. This is an extremely fringe. They make the NRA look like choir boys. These are the real extremists, and I don't think that there's a lot of people who really side with them because they're just too fringy. They want a gun in every hand. A gun pointed out of every window. A gun. And if you can get a anti-aircraft gun mounted on your roof, then have at it.
That's pretty wild. So, okay, well, let's take a moment here. We're coming to the end of our hour. I just want to thank you, Andy Goddard, the legislative director for Virginians for gun safety, for the gun safety. Repeat that title again. Virginia Center for Public Safety. And your website?
vacps.org. And if anybody who watches this would like more information, I can be contacted through that website, and I'd be happy to share bill lists or analysis of any bill if you have a specific request.
Okay, great. And once again, we want to remind people that today is the 92nd anniversary of Martin Luther King's birthday. On the 18th, on Monday, celebrations will be official. And your organization and others in our state will be holding a special online events in the afternoon, I believe.
And at 1:15 somewhere there, yeah.
And it'll go on for a little bit to learn about, to honor Martin Luther King and learn about what's happening with regard to gun laws. It'll be a very educational and meaningful.
I believe we're going to have the governor and probably the attorney general speak as well.
Excellent. Well, we'll want to get this out, and I hope that people will take the opportunity to tune in on Monday the way they, if they haven't been able to tune in yet today live, they'll hopefully get a chance to see this before Monday so they can take advantage of this heads up.
And let's pray that Sunday and Monday and the inauguration day on Wednesday go off without any nonsense and no violence.
Absolutely. This is, sort of a frightening time. And we have to hope and pray that people come to their senses and that the talk online is just talk and not serious. If they respect law enforcement, they won't seek confrontations, especially since, the most amazing thing about this whole story is that the president told his followers at that rally that if only the vice president would go along with him, that he could remain president. That's just not true. The Constitution ends his
Not on
presidency.
any universe would that be true.
The Constitution ends his presidency at noon on January 20th, whether Mike Pence agrees or not, whether they certify Joe Biden's presidential election on January 6th or not. And
From
if
hell or high water.
yes, and if Joe Biden couldn't have been sworn in on January 20th, well, under the Constitution, Nancy Pelosi would have been sworn in as Speaker of the House. And if something had happened to prevent Nancy from being sworn in, the person who was Speaker would take that role. There was nothing anyone in that crowd could do to change the outcome that Donald Trump's presidency would end.
And
the
for
fact
how
that
many years has it been, that way? I mean, we've never had to worry about this before.
It's amazing. It's amazing. Well, all right. So on that note, let's hope for the best, and we'll look forward to continuing this, and hopefully with good news to talk about on next Friday.
Yes, there will be movement this coming week. Yeah.
Take care.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.